Can you tell us your name, where and when you were born, and where you grew up?
My name is James M. Denny. I was born in the Fabiola Hospital, which is covered by the freeway now, in 1911, March 19th, 1911.
Who were your parents and where were they born?
Well, my mother was May Lennon, and she was born in Arizona. My father was Carl B. Denny, and he was born in Callahan's.
Thank you. Can you tell us how the rivers and creeks looked when you were a boy and how they have changed today?
Yes. The river was ran in a checkerboard throughout the valley, first to the right, then to the left, and there was a hole about every 100 yards or less, and there was from 15 to 20 feet deep and from, sometimes 50 yards long, and the water would run into the willows that would always be on the bank where the river was, and when it got high, it just ran through the willows and up over and out and spread out over the valley and dropped sediment and dirt on top of the ground.
How do you see that being different today?
Well, there aren't any holes left. There aren't any willows left that the river could run into. There's willows along the course of the river, but it doesn't resemble the old river at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then especially in the upper end of the river where the dredger tailings are, that was a place that everybody liked to fish because it was one hole right after another. There's nothing but gravel up there now.
And that's come from the water washing through the tailings?
Well, the river doesn't function well in the dredger tailing. It sinks out of sight during the low water period.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember seeing that area around Callahan before the dredger tailings were there?
I saw it plenty. Saw it all the time. Every time I went to Callahan, couldn't help but see it.
And so you're saying there were just a lot of holes in through
That's
there,
right.
and lots of willows and good fishing spots.
Best fishing in the world. My grandmother used to send my father in the 1890s down to Sugar Creek to get fish for supper. He would leave after grammar school and be back by 6:30, and he'd have 150 trout that averaged 10 inches long. Well,
That's wonderful.
this isn't exactly true because there were 150 young silver salmon, or dog salmon as they were called by the natives. There weren't really trout, but they were still 10 inches long.
Mm-hmm. What different kinds of salmon do you remember seeing in the river over the course of a year?
Well, there were salmon we called dog salmon, which were a variety of silver salmon. From 1865 or 1870 to 1955, there were no king salmon in the valley. There was a blockage in the river put in by cleavers, a mining family down the river, and it created a dam that the salmon had to jump over. Well, the king salmon weren't able to jump it, but the steelhead and dog salmon were. Then in 1955, the first of the three big floods in the present history of Scott Valley, that was washed out. And my brother-in-law had the ranch at that time, Dick Hayden, and he happened to go down with a pitchfork and he saw all these big fish 3 or 4 feet long. He couldn't figure out what they were, but they were so thick that he scraped one of them out on the bank with a pitchfork and took it home and ate it and found it very good.
And that was a king salmon?
That was the king salmon. That was the first king salmon. They've been coming in the valley ever since 1955.
And where was the Cleavers Dam?
Down in the Scott River Canyon, at the Cleaver Resort.
At the Cleaver Resort, yeah. Which is no longer there.
No.
And what sort of a place was the Cleaver Resort?
Oh, it was a place for fishermen.
A fishing
resort.
There
used to be 3 fishing resorts on Scott Valley and Scott River in the canyon. There's none today.
Mm-hmm. And they were very popular?
Oh, In the old days, the Salmon River, or the Scott River and the Salmon River and the Klamath River, when the steelhead fishing was good, there was a fisherman every 50 feet, and every fisherman had fish.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's not true today, I guess.
They were using primitive tackle compared to what they use today. They all caught fish.
Hmm. Now, in terms of salmon, you mentioned there were steelhead and dog salmon. What about the coho?
Well, coho and dog salmon are the same thing.
Coho and dog.
People called the silver salmon up in Scott River dog salmon. There are no real dog salmon in here.
So the coho were the dog salmon.
Yes, they were the biggest run of any. The farmers used to run their spring wagons out in the side tributaries like French Creek and Sugar Creek, and in 30 minutes they'd fill up the spring wagon with a pitchfork with these salmon, and all the farmers had barrels with made into fire, so they could put these salmon in the barrels and boil them, because they made the pigs sick if they didn't feed them after they were cooked.
Hmm. And those were cohos.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
They used to use those. There's some left, but you can't find them. I haven't seen one in years.
Mm-hmm. What did the cohos look like?
Well, actually, they looked a good deal like the king salmon, but they were littler and they have a white mouth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy to tell them if you find the carcass.
Mm-hmm. And how did you tell the king salmon?
Well, there weren't any when I was a boy.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
None
that's
came out.
right. You never saw any of
Never
those.
saw 'em.
Right. What are the biggest changes that you see in the environment over your lifetime?
Well, as far as the river's concerned, the lack of fish.
Mm-hmm.
But it isn't just the lack of fish, it's a lack of fish habitat.
Mm-hmm.
There's no habitat for the fish anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There's no holding water. If a steelhead wants to stop and spawn, he's got to be a good swimmer, because he has to swim all the time. There's no place to rest.
Mm-hmm. What do you think has created those changes in the river?
Well, the river was, there were three floods, 75, 60, 4, and 74, and that washed out most of the willows, and it straightened the river, washed out most of the holes, but the dredger tailings did most of the damage. Every year, if the water's high at all, there's thousands of tons of dredger tailings washed down through the valley, and they pound the bottom of the river to death. It's terrible, and they kill all the aquatic insects, all the aquatic life, and the holes are all filled up. It's sad.
Mm-hmm.
They could bring the holes back, of course,
How could that be done?
by putting a log on the bank, fastening it, and fastening it so that it's over the river at a 45-degree angle and goes up and down with the water, and as the water runs under it, it pushes the gravel out and forms a hole. It wouldn't be as good as the original, but of course eventually, if they leave the river alone, in 1,000 or 2,000 years, it'll come back anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Whether there'll be any fish left or not by then is debatable.
Mm-hmm. So if we can wait 2,000 years, then we got a
Well,
opportunity.
it's very debatable whether people would stand still for it. They would just think of something else to do to the river.
Could you describe your favorite fishing spots, what they looked like, where they were, when you were a boy?
Well, we used to catch big trout in the river. Every hole had 7 or 8 trout over 3 or 4 pounds, and we learned over a period of time how to catch them. And there was one hole down in McBride's ranch that was typical of the holes I've described. It had the water flowed right into the willows, and then it made a right angle turn, and I never failed to at least get a bite at that hole when I fished there. But if you wanted to catch these fish, they ate almost entirely crawfish, and they came out from under the willows on a time. They were on a regular timetable. Every half hour one would come out, and another one would come out every 45 minutes and so forth. And we would take our watch and time these, and we would have a bucket of crawfish, and we would have a double snelled hook, so we could take a rubber band and fasten the crawfish to the hook. And if we dropped the crawfish in the water, just minutes before the trout was going to come out, and 9 times out of 10 he would bite it and run out into shallow water and break the leader, because we had to use a 2-pound test leader to do this. But I like that kind of fishing just about as well as anything, although my real favorite is stream fishing in the small streams.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What streams were your favorites?
Well, French Creek was my favorite, with Paynes Lake Creek being the number 1 stream. French Creek that I like best. The thing that people don't realize about the fishing was that in those days, before under 4,000 feet, 50 to 60% of the fish were all little salmon. And people went up there and they caught them like mad, and they thought they were catching trout. So the fishing will never be as good again, because the trout just don't multiply, and they're not present in large numbers like the salmon used to be. Above that elevation, the fishing is about as good as it ever was, because with the 2-fish limit and the license, it's ridiculous. People don't even bother to fish, or if they do, they take all they can get when they're sure the game warden isn't around, and take off.
What do you think happened to all the crawfish that used to be in the river?
Well, there were millions of crawfish, and that's what those big trout lived on. I cut the stomach open on a big trout I caught one time that weighed 5 pounds, and there were 23 parts of 23 crawfish in that stomach. But they were pounded to death by the dredger rocks. That's where they went. And they can't survive in running water. They tend to be all in the lower end of the holes, and under rocks where the water is still most of the time.
And those holes don't
They're
exist
gone. No,
anymore.
not there.
On the fishing holes that you liked, besides willows, what other aspects of vegetation were there?
There were cottonwoods and alders there. Sometimes a pine tree was along the edge of the river, but most of the vegetation was willows. I'd say 90%.
How did the climate changes affect the fish?
The climate changes? Well, I don't know that it did. That's out of my line. I can't answer that.
The floods you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you remember that some years there were more salmon than other years?
Oh yeah. But I'll tell you, people don't realize how many fish there were. The Young's Dam was put up, and it's made with a big cement platform, and then there's cement blocks that go out on it. Well, you could lie on one of those cement blocks, and the fish had to get over a foot board that was in there, and they'd come up and hit the board, and they'd turn on their side and float back. You could pick up a gunny sack in a half hour.
What year would that have been?
Oh, 26. Same year that my brother and I set the record of 36 steelhead caught and released in 1 hour.
My goodness.
I assume it's a record because I've never heard of anybody catching more. We were the original catch and release fishermen in the Scott River.
What was your brother's name?
Carl. The funny thing is that we didn't do it to save the fish exactly, but we refused to eat steelhead and trout out of the river. And so when we caught them, rather than throw them on the bank and kill them. We just put them back.
Uh-huh.
But we didn't feel.
So you were conservationists, sort of not by design, but
No.
by practicality.
We only ate the fish out of the cold streams on the side of the valley.
Now, why was that?
Well, because they were so much better tasting, and they had more flavor. I'll tell you, the first time I went fishing, I was 7 years of age. I went in Paynes Lake Creek with my father and brother, and I had never caught a fish before in my life. Well, no, I hadn't. And so I caught 17. We had a picnic, and we went after the picnic. And my dad caught 43, and my brother caught 95. And that was in an hour and a half.
My goodness.
The fishing was actually so good in Paynes Lake Creek that you could put the pole over your shoulder with the bait and turn your back to the creek and drop the thing in the water, and you'd get a bite wherever it hit.
My goodness. But now, of course, that was, say that was in 1918 that you're describing, probably, if you were 7?
No. Yeah, that's right, 1918.
1918. And you mentioned that there were just so many fish in those years.
Yeah.
Then as the years went on, did you notice, say before the floods really changed the atmosphere of the river and that and the
Well, the
banks?
fish started going down when they built the Scott Valley Irrigation District.
That was what, 1945 in there?
I don't know when it was.
Could you describe what you saw with the Scott Valley Irrigation Dish?
That eliminated half the valley as the fish raising and spawning area because there wasn't enough water left in the river.
Up above?
No, below.
Below.
Yeah.
Did you notice from year to year, as you were growing up, that some years there would be a bigger fish run than another year?
Well, it was so big every year that it was hard to tell the difference. There was never any shortage of fish in my youth. There was fish all the time.
Can you describe what seasons brought which fish in during the year?
Well, of course, the first fish to come was the dog salmon, and they came with the first rain in the fall, and steelhead came with them. There were 3 runs of steelhead in the early days. There was a run in November and December, and they were bigger than the other steelhead. And then there was a run in January, and those were medium sized, and then the big run came in March and April. And the March and April run, the fish only ran about 3 pounds.
How big were the ones in the, say, the November, December?
4 and 5 in the middle run, and the last run was 8 to 10 pounds. The first run, they were 8 to 10.
Quite a difference in size.
Yeah. I don't think there's many of the big ones left, if any.
Now you say that there were so many fish that you couldn't have said there were, say, from over a 10-year period, that there were any differences in numbers. There were just many, many all the time.
And you see, I left home to go to college in 28. I came back in the summertime, but I was gone in the winter. So in essence, I had no access to information after 1928. And most of the demise of the fish came after 28.
Do you remember putting in the levees, the Army Corps put in the levees and straightened out the river? Is that something that you witnessed?
I knew it was being done, but we don't own any land on the river. And of course, anytime you straighten out a river, you make a ditch out of it. And you make a ditch out of it, it becomes an unviable fish stream.
When you...
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
When you used to go fishing down along the river, was it hard to get to the river because of the amount of vegetation?
No, any rancher let us go on. We didn't have to ask any questions about the rancher or whatever.
Mm-hmm. What about just difficulty of getting through the amount of vegetation along the river?
No. There were lots of spaces where there was no vegetation,
Mm-hmm.
but there was vegetation at all the critical points.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Did you used to swim in the river?
There was 50 swimming pools right out off of our ranch out here.
Now, where would those 50 be? Between where and where?
Well, between the McBride Ranch and the Horn Lane Bridge.
And who owns the McBride Ranch today?
Spencer.
Spencer. So there were 50 holes between
Yeah.
Spencer's and Horn Lane.
Yeah.
What were those swimming holes like? Could you describe them?
Well, they were all about the same. They all had 10 to 15 feet of deep water at the head of the hole and going down to eventually 4 or 5 feet. They were varying lengths, 50 yards long to some of them maybe only 20 yards.
Was the water cold?
The water wasn't cold on the top, but if you went down 3 or 4 feet, it was icy cold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The underground aquifer ran through the river all the time and kept the river very cold.
Mm-hmm.
It was very deceptive, but people would take temperature of the river, the top was warm as toast, but it was actually cold underneath.
Mm-hmm.
We used to, like I said, we wouldn't eat the trout out of the river, but we had to catch them sometimes for our friends that came from the city because they didn't know one fish from another. And my brother and I were fishing one time and we got bored and we found a red crawfish. Crawfish are normally brown. So we climbed out on the willows over about 10 feet of water and we threw out this crawfish and we estimated that 1,000 fish over 10 inches long came and tried to get this crawfish.
And where was that?
That was down at McBride Ranch.
That's quite a hole.
Yeah, it's gone now.
What year would that have been?
That was about 23.
That's amazing.
Well, I think that if Scott River had been known, it would have been considered one of the best trout streams in the state of California at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody knew about it. Up here. Communications weren't what they are today.
Mm-hmm.
But it obviously was as good a fishing stream as it was in California.
Mm-hmm. All the fishing holes, and I guess the swimming holes too, had quite a bit of willow and tree and cover.
One side of them was 100% willows or trees. The other side was usually a sandy bank.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was this, if the river ran into the bank, it would be the right side of the river going downstream. Well, no, the left side of the river. But depending on the direction of the river, the holes would vary.
Mm-hmm. But the good fishing holes mostly had one side at least that had very, very good shade and cover.
Yeah.
Were there in-stream structures of any kind that the fish used to use that you remember?
I don't remember anything between Young's Dam and Horn Lane.
Like logs in the river, or?
There were lots of logs and sticks that helped make the holes
Mm-hmm.
that were embedded in the bank.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the floods probably took out most of that character of the river.
They took it out entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in 1933, they had the WPA cut down all the willows along the river, and that had a big effect on it too.
What did you used to do with the fish that you caught?
Put them back.
Some of them you ate.
We only kept the big ones. The big ones tasted good.
Uh-huh.
We kept the ones that weighed 2 or 3 or 5 pounds. When they got big enough to live on a crawfish diet, they developed flavor.
Uh-huh.
But the little ones didn't have any flavor in the river, at least in our opinion.
Uh-huh.
Neither my mother, father, or any of us 3 boys would eat them.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. What do you think are the major factors that have affected the size of the fish population?
Well, the major factor is lack of habitat. Probably the drought has certainly affected it. You see, it didn't just lack of habitat exactly. With the filling up of all the holes, then when the sun shines on the river, all the water is hot. That cold water that used to run underground and be deep in the bottom of those holes and make the perfect temperature for fish is all gone.
The sedimentation filled in?
Well,
or how did that work?
Well, it's a combination of things. If the dredger tailings have simply fill up every hole. And I don't know if you want to call it sedimentation or not, but you'll never get the fish back unless you bring the holes back. The low water isn't so bad in the river because in the old days, the water got, in 1926, the whole river was dry, but there was water in all the holes. And the water in the holes was cool. Wasn't hot. And so all the fish survived. Today, if they had a drought like 1926, the whole river would dry up and there wouldn't be anything. No holes or anything.
Now the holes were deep enough,
Yeah,
and they were being fed by the aquifers also,
yeah,
and that's what kept them cool?
sure. That was the main reason the river raised fish like it did. Was the cold water in the bottom of the pool. All you had to do was dive in there and go down and you'd find out it was cold enough.
So now the underground aquifer is no longer...
Oh no, it's still there, but it can't function. It probably runs, but it runs through gravel.
Because it's filled in.
Yeah.
Interesting. What about the vegetation changes on the river? Do you think that's affected the fish population?
Well, it may affect it a little, but it doesn't do much good to shade water that's only 2 feet deep. It does some good, but not much. You've got to have it 4 or 5 or 6 feet deep, and preferably 10 or 20 feet deep.
And I think you said that until the dredger tailings are taken care of, it's not going to be easy to get the holes back. Is that right?
To take care of the dredger tailings, they'll have to put a dam across, lower into the dredger tailing. That's the only solution there is.
Unless you sell them and get them hauled out of here.
Well, no, it won't. They're still going to be there. The dredger went down 50 feet, and it'll wash away the underground ones as well as the ones on top of the ground. Then you can start bringing holes back mechanically, and they should haul several million tons of gravel out of the river. It's overloaded. In fact, at Fay Lane, if they don't do something in a year or two, they're going to have a disaster over there, and it's going to cut through the river's going to cut through the Oak Farm and make a brand new channel halfway down the valley. Because it's within 6 inches of doing it now. See, where there used to be a 10-foot deep hole under the bridge, there's nothing but gravel now. There's a shortage of gravel too, so they have no trouble selling it.
Do you remember the river being in more than one channel as you were growing up, or changing channels over the years?
No, from the time I was a kid, 1915, didn't know anything about it. There wasn't a flood in the river until 1955, and the river stayed in the same channel.
at least up at this end,
Yeah.
towards McConaughey End.
Yeah.
It may have channelized
Down
the river differently. Uh-huh. What animals do you remember seeing around the river when you were a boy?
Well, coyotes, raccoons. That's about all. Saw deer.
Any beaver?
No, there's more beaver in the valley now than there were then.
Well, a lot of them were hunted out, I guess,
Yeah,
around the
they
turn
were
of the
caught.
century.
They were taken out. There were no beaver at all.
Mm-hmm.
No geese either.
No geese.
No geese then.
When do you remember seeing the first geese?
Frankly, 1970 when I retired, because I noticed the geese. I don't know if they started much before that or not. They just decided to settle in here.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think they have any effect on the fishing.
Right. What about ducks or...
There were more ducks.
Mm-hmm.
There are.
What types do you remember?
Mallards. Pintail. I guess they're pintails.
Mm-hmm.
But there were more mallards than anything else.
Mm-hmm. How would you compare the population when you were a boy to what you see today? Mallards.
Oh, about 3 times as many.
Before.
Before.
Any idea what happened to them?
Well, I don't know. I don't like to hunt, but discouraged them a lot.
Tell us any remembrances of McConaughey Creek.
Well, McConaughey Creek dried up when A.H. Denny extended the Farmers Ditch Company to supply water to the Young Ranch and the McBride ranches. And at the time, they just dammed up the McConaughey Creek and turned it into the new ditch that they built, and they didn't have to bring any more water down from the headwaters of the Scott River because they got plenty out of McConaughey Creek.
Mm-hmm. What year would that have been?
1900 to 1905 in there. But McConaughey Creek used to run through the best fields in Oak Farm and the McBride Ranch, and then it ran over through the slough down by Ken Fowles and into the river at Young's Point. And naturally, those ranchers didn't like it very well because it ran through all their best fields, so they were all in favor of shutting the McConaughey Creek too. The fact that they shut off all the fish around McConaughey Creek didn't mean a thing to them.
So you're saying that the McConaughey Creek used to run between the river and what would be the present East Side Road?
Young's Point, yes.
Uh-huh.
Down at the river, Young's Point. You can still see the old channel goes down into the field there at Bride Ranch. You can see it.
You can.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And you said, of course, all the fish. Can you tell me how many fish were in McConaughey, or what?
Well,
was it a spawning stream, or what
I don't know
remembrances?
how many were in at that time, but McConaughey Creek had so many fish that it drew Indian tribes from the Shasta Valley and the Klamath River. They came up here to they could just dip the fish out with their hands, and then there was lots of acorns in McConaughey Gulf. They got acorns, and then the deer were just coming down from the high mountains when these fish came in. They had sore feet, so they got the deer easily. So there were at least 7 villages up McConaughey that were only occupied during the time that the Indians came to catch the fish and deer and the acorns.
Now, do you know how far back that memory goes of those stories, or?
It isn't very good information as to how far or what, but I imagine it goes back hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So did
the Indians didn't care to live in McConaughey year round.
mm-hmm.
Don't have a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They just moved in for the
Did they used to dry the fish right here, do you think?
I don't know that.
Uh-huh.
Probably did though. You had to dry them
Mm-hmm.
when you first caught them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what did McConaughey look like after 1905?
Well, looked the same, but there was no fish left.
There was still water in it, though.
Oh, yeah. I don't know for sure when it started to produce so little water that they had to enlarge the ditch. But that time came sometime between 1905 and 1925.
Mm-hmm. That means that they took more water out of the Scott River?
Yeah.
So somewhere between 1905 and 1925, McConaughey had less water in it, and they had to go to the river to get more water.
Yeah, to supply Youngstown and Brides with water.
Mm-hmm. Now, your remembrance of McConaughey Creek in McConaughey Gulch itself.
Well, I have no remembrance of the creek running to the river because it was shut off before I was born.
Mm-hmm. But it runs from year to year often now, if
Well,
there'll be water in it.
It ran for 8 months last year.
Mm-hmm.
And one other year it ran 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
And if we got 2 wet years in a row, it'd probably run year round, but we don't seem to get it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think my own remembrance is that it ran most of the time before the drought, the last 10 years of drought, that we used to see it running.
Well,
some.
Yes, it ran some for 4 or 5 months
Mm-hmm.
every year. When we were running the ranch, and I was working in the hay crew, there was always enough water in McConaughey Creek that we filled our canteens out of it every year, every
Mm-hmm.
summer. It ran from the ranch to the river probably the year round.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a few fish came up and spawned in it, but not many.
Mm-hmm. What year do you remember seeing some spawning fish in there?
I can't say, but about 1917 or 18.
And your guess it would be that before they took the water out of it, they were going a good ways up McConaughey
Well,
Gulch,
no.
the spawners?
No, they were spawning down in our field.
Mm-hmm. They couldn't get further on up?
They couldn't get up, no.
But they did spawn in the Denny Ranch fields, but not farther up as far as you know. And would those be dog salmon?
Yeah.
But not the king or
Coho.
the cohos?
Yeah. No king.
Mm-hmm. So you remember seeing spawners in the fields
Yeah.
as a boy?
Yeah.
For how many years maybe would you seen them there?
5 or 6.
5 or 6. How many would you say there were?
Oh, there were very few. I don't know. They probably had trouble getting through down in Oak Farm.
Very few, like under 10?
Yeah.
How have the hillsides changed around this area here, in your opinion, or across the valley towards Callahan or towards Etna?
I don't think they changed at all.
They look pretty much the same to you?
Exactly the same.
How about has the logging made any impacts?
Well, there's been no logging here. Not around here.
Well, in the early days, of course, at McConaughey, they took out quite a bit of the pine.
Yeah, but that's way up there.
Mm-hmm.
My dad sold $500 worth of, $500 or $1,000 worth of logs on the far side, but it didn't make any difference in the looks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the hillsides to you are pretty much the same as they've always been.
Yeah.
And the vegetation and types of trees, are they changed at all since you were a boy?
The only difference is the demise of the wildflowers.
Ah.
That was done, we rented our ranch to a Angus breeder, and the Angus cattle went all the way up to the top of the hill, and they, in 5 years, they practically eliminated every wildflower on the ranch.
How about the grasses on the ranch here? Have they changed over time?
Well, the only way they've changed is fewer, but not enough to make much difference.
Do you have any historic remembrances or stories about how many ranches used to be up McConaughey Gulch?
There were 10 ranches in the Conejo Gulch. And each ranch raised a family, and they milked their cows and sold their pigs, and they had enough water when they were operating to operate without taking water out of McConaughey Creek.
Where did they get their water?
Rain.
So there was considerably more rainfall.
No. When the white men first came to this country, all these hills were covered with a mulch as well as the grass. And 100% of the rainfall went into the ground, and that water ran out over the year. But as the white man pastured and fiddled around, he destroyed that mulch, and that's why the water doesn't get in the ground. It runs off, and there's no water. But there's the same amount of rainfall. There's a rainfall chart I took out of the papers of 1865 to 1885, and it's almost exactly the same as today.
Do you have a copy of that?
Yeah.
So you're saying that the use of cattle,
Yep.
horses, or
Overgrazing.
overgrazing destroyed the mulch
Yeah.
on the ground?
Well, you can, and not only that, they used to, Wolfords used to cut alfalfa hay at McConaughey Gulch, and it took them 3 weeks with a crew of 10, 12 men to get the hay out, and they raise it every year, and then since they've overgrazed the same area, there's nothing. It's just like a flat board doing nothing.
In other words, you can't raise alfalfa
Oh, sure
out
you
there.
could. You could raise alfalfa there, but you'd have to do different than they do now. Dry land alfalfa.
So what you're saying is that when the crew went in, it took them 3 weeks. I mean, there was so much alfalfa that,
Alfalfa was 4.5 feet high.
and that you attribute that to this mulch and to
Well,
the good
no.
conditions that existed.
I attribute that to the fact that they planted the alfalfa and let it grow, but the reason that there's no pasture now is because the mulch is gone.
Okay. I understand.
There's some places that it's coming back.
Up McConaughey?
Well, down where Horn Lane runs into the East Side Road, I haven't seen any cattle there in 20 years up until this year, and I can see that the mulch was starting to come back a little bit, but I suppose if they start pasturing again, they'll eat it off.
Mm-hmm.
But then what you can do.
Mm-hmm. So you just mentioned a little bit about how farm practices maybe have changed in the number of cattle that are pastured. How else do you see farm practices
Well,
changing?
they're good down in the valley, but they're poor up McConaughey Gulch because they try to take out of the land more than it could give, and so they're against the law of diminishing returns. Every year they get less.
Mm-hmm.
If they take less, they could start to go back and have every year they'd be able to put a little more, but they don't see it.
Mm-hmm. How would you describe taking too much? What are they taking too much of?
Well, they take all the grass, all the seed, there's nothing left. Can't replant it, so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could you comment on changes in irrigation practices, amount of land farmed, number of crops that are taken today as compared to, say, in your father's time?
Well, in my father's time, the average ranch in Scott Valley took a cutting and a half of hay. And that's when the surface water ran out. And today they cut 3 or 4 cuttings by using a type of sprinkle irrigation, and they can irrigate 3 times as much land with the same amount of water as they could with the other way. So there's some good sides to it and some bad sides, but one of the big differences between my father's time and now is that on Sunday, in his day, none of the farmers worked. And I said, well, I really think that was nice. I think that it would be nice if none of the farmers worked on Sunday.
Mm-hmm. Gave everything a little bit of a rest, you mean?
Well, yeah. You're only going to get so much anyway, and the idea of working on Sunday is, in my opinion, is not good, but then that's just my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Do you see people running more cattle today too?
Well, yes, there's more cattle, but down where they've got the irrigation, they're raising much more pasture in the same amount of ground, so they can run more cattle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The farmers of the day are about twice as smart as the farmers were that were at my dad's time, George McBride and Fritz Young.
Are you saying that because they went to college,
No,
or
I'm saying it because they are.
how do you?
Well, they know how to outcross stock, and they know that if you don't keep them growing all the time, they don't do good. There's all kinds of things. They're just better.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember riding around the old Dodge with my dad. We'd meet Fritz Young and stop, and then John Wolford would come along, and pretty soon George McBride would be there, and they'd all be telling each other how much they worked and how hard they worked. And I was a little kid. I couldn't quite see it.
You saw them sitting around talking
Yeah.
a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Do you remember any stories from the farm days that are
He told me.
funny or?
No, I saw him. I saw him, I think.
I don't really remember
But
any.
I
I suppose I should, but I don't.
Thanks to you and thanks to him.
But I'll tell you one thing that was nicer. Everybody had trust in everybody else, and you could go on anybody's property anytime, and there wasn't a thought given to the way it is now. If you go on somebody's property, they'll shoot you. And I think it was much nicer in the days of trust.
Mm-hmm. What do you think has changed that trust?
Well, the farmers feel that I think it's been brought about mostly by the fish situation, the disappearance of the fish, and the farmers think that they're getting blamed for all the reasons that they're gone, and they don't like it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think we can do about that?
Well, explain to them that the miners and the loggers and the farmers and even individual people are as much responsible as the farmers are, and all we can do is sit down and try to do the best we can.
Mm-hmm.
Cooperation is the spirit.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, is it possible to bring the fish back into?
I think about 20%.
Mm-hmm.
That's about the best we could hope for.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how we could bring back all of them.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be nice to bring back those 20%.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of course, one reason that the trust is not here anymore, there were 1,100 people in Scott Valley in the early days, and for years the same people owned the land. Then as other people started buying the land with different ideas out of cities and so forth, you naturally got a different attitude.
And probably in the future, we're going to have even more people here.
Yeah, it's going to be even worse. But another thing, of course, in those days, the farmers controlled the valley. They were a political force that was in the majority. And today, the farmers are in the minority, and so they no longer control the valley, and that's another reason that they've got something on their shoulder ready to get knocked off. Because they resent the fact that they can no longer control the valley.
Now, is that because new people have moved in and...
Sure, and they got a vote. There's 6,000 people now. It used to be there was only 1,100, and they were almost all farmers.
So that's definitely a change.
Yeah, no doubt.
What do you think your dad would think if he was alive today?
Well, he would side with the farmers naturally, but I don't know what he'd think. It's hard to say.
I wonder if he'd still want to be a farmer.
Yes, he would. He'd always want to be. He started out to train for a minister.
Oh.
And he went to college 6 months when he decided he wanted to be a farmer, so he came back and ran his grandfather's farm for 3 years, and then he bought part of it, the part that is in the family now.
That's the KV Denny Ranch, as we call it.
It's interesting how my grandfather gave $5,000 to my father. He had paid $3,000 for this ranch, and so when he sold it to my father, he sold it to him for $12,000, knocked off 5, that's 7. That still leaves him a profit of 4.
So he did rather well getting his son a ranch, right? He profited from that.
Well, my grandfather always made money. Everything he did turned to money. That's more than I can say for his sons and grandsons.
Yeah, I've heard you say that before. Yeah. And this is, I guess, the last ranch that's left.
It's the last ranch in the Denny family, yeah.
And it's still very prosperous.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think is the future of dairy farming if that was to come back again?
Well, I think that it probably has a better future than any other type of farming for this valley. Because under the NAFTA agreement, the beef business looks terrible. It looks like our beef is going to be supplied by Canada and Mexico. And there's only so much room for the hay business if they're not going to raise the beef. Although more hay goes for dairying than beef, there's going to be trouble in the hay business, but people will always drink milk. And this is an ideal spot for dairy.
Now, in the early years, I think more crops were put to grain than they are today.
Well, in the 1860s, Scott Valley was a grain capital of the West almost. It was the main reason that a railroad was almost built here 3 times. There were about at least 5 flour mills, and they produced top-grade wheat and had top-grade flour, and they sold their wheat and flour all over western United States. But eventually, because they didn't have any good transportation, they couldn't compete in the business, and the flour mills all dried up. And another thing, the east side of Scott Valley had no water, and they used to plant the grain in the fall every year, and they never had a crop failure. It was winter wheat. And it's always something to think about going back to if we have to cut back on water.
So the moisture that comes in the winter months will provide for that winter crop of grain. And then when would that be harvested?
Well, I can't tell you for
Would
sure.
it be in the spring? It would have been
fall.
Oh, it would have been planted in the fall and harvested in the fall.
Yeah.
but there was enough moisture,
Well,
at least in earlier days, to harvest a fall
well,
crop.
there's probably enough moisture today to harvest a fall crop.
When would you plant that?
November.
Really?
Yeah. November and December.
Is when you plant it. And then you'd harvest it, obviously.
Regular time.
Uh-huh.
Because it's harvested. But it doesn't take any water.
Yeah. No, it
We
wouldn't.
don't irrigate it.
No, it wouldn't. Well, let's take a break here and see how we're doing. Can you tell us something about the remains of the Indian civilization that you found around here, and anyone else can chime in if they've got information?
Well, there were, as I said once before, 7 Indian villages in McConaughey, but there was one Indian village down on Oak Farm that was right where the river drops, the land level drops about 20 feet down to the level of the river. They were right on that edge of that, and we used to find arrowheads constantly. In fact, you could find arrowheads any place on this ranch back in before 1920. I don't know whether they'd been shot or whether they were dropped or what, but we had big collections of arrowheads, but they all got burned up in a fire. And there was one place on the ranch where one time they were cleaning the ditch, and my brother and I happened to be over there watching them. They were using Fresno scrapers, and we found 3 quartz arrowheads about 3 inches long in the muck that came out of the ditch. And I got to looking at the place afterwards, and I decided that probably it was an old Indian burial ground. And I've since never let anybody look for Indian artifacts there. But, and then...
What area was that?
It's by it's just on our property inside the fence before it comes to the...
By the well house.
Before it comes to Wilkerson's.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Above the ditch.
But on our side?
It's our side.
Above the ditch to the south, then?
Yeah.
Okay.
But then why my mother didn't tell me that there was one of the villages was out in this spot, I don't know. And we started a commercial garden a few years back, and then fortunately we hired Hersh Dillman and his rototiller to till it, and he must have turned up 15 or 20 Indian artifacts, but only in broken pieces. But they were, what do you call them? Anyway.
They were right out here where the big garden has been? The mortars and pestles?
Yeah.
Yes.
But if we'd have plowed it, we'd have got some of them. I think we only got one that didn't get broken. That's about all I know.
Albert, you were remembering your dad mentioning some depressions.
Yeah, that's down Oak Farm where Jim was talking about the river.
Mm-hmm.
We used to go down there when I was a kid and find pieces of arrowheads. No good arrowheads. They were just small pieces of obsidian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember your dad telling any more?
Not really. I think one of the neatest thing that was ever found down there was the pipe that Warren Parker's daughter found. It was a solid granite pipe, and I don't know how the Indians made a hole through the small part of the pipe, but somehow they did. Have you ever Ever seen that?
No. Where is that?
It's down at Warren's house.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's still down there in that case that he has.
Uh-huh. Hmm.
I found it, well, the funny thing is that we found, the arrowheads that we found away from the villages were better than the ones we found in the villages. In the villages, they were usually ones that they were working on and broke when they were,
Yeah.
so they let them drop, and then if they lost them when they were firing at a bird or something, the arrow disintegrated and the arrowhead stayed. We found good ones. And one time I found one that was made out of red quartz, and that was my pride and joy.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
But it went with the fire.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you remember of the villages that were up McConaughey? Weren't there some in Trail Gulch or
Well, yeah,
Indian?
there were other all over up there, but I don't remember anything of them because they weren't functioning when I
Mm-hmm.
was old enough to know what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But we did know that they came there for the fish. That's
Mm-hmm.
the reason that they were villages there.
Do you think they came over from Gazelle into McConaughey that way?
Of course, went back of Mount Shasta,
Mm-hmm.
and went also down the Klamath River.
They came up into McConaughey.
Yeah, it's easier to get fish out of McConaughey than out of Klamath River.
Mm-hmm. So probably Shastas and Karooks were coming in here.
I think they were both,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but we'll never know for sure.
Mm-hmm. No, I guess we won't.
Guess you're using your tape up for no good reason.
Okay. Thank you very much.